All right, so again, on the left side over here, we have a link tag in our head. So there's a lot more going on than we're used to here. But this is the same thing as our boilerplate where we're saying, in the head tag, here's a link. Its relation is that it's a style sheet. It's a type of text CSS. The media is going to be our screen. And the hyperlink reference is the project CSS. Now, conveniently, I just so happen to have that located right next to it. So that's why I'm able to just reference it as project CSS. But if we have these side by side and I collapse this left side, we can see I have the hashtags and I have the periods. So the periods, the dots, stand for classes. And so here we can see the class. This is Bootstrap. If you guys remember, I kind of touched up on like container fluid a little bit. I didn't explain any of this, so I don't expect any of you guys to know what this means. But this is, if you see container fluid, then you know it's Bootstrap. So in this class, we have container fluid body. Let's see if I created any styling for that. I did not. I had created styling for my body right here. And since I reference it with a dot, this is going to look for any class of body. So although it's not immediately apparent, this is actually affecting this right here. So instead of me having to come in here and type style equals, I know I do it, the background color, blue, I did an RGB value over here. I'm guessing it's this color, light blue. We have a little preview. If I just leave my cursor here, we get this little, you should have this. This is just part of VS Code. If we want, we could just decide whatever we want it to be in the RGBs. So instead of having to come over here and be like, background color is blue, height is 90 view height, and padding is 0 important, I can simply do all that in the CSS file on the right and just pass in body. I don't pass in container fluid because there's a space here. These aren't necessarily correlated. I can pass in body and it knows that I'm talking specifically about this. And if I actually had body here as well, it would assume I'm talking about that as well. So if you have just like a simple word, let's see if I have covers. I do, see? So right here, it's ignoring container fluid. It doesn't really care because there's a space, and that's the important differentiation. Is we have kind of, as far as the computer is concerned, two class names, and we could call this based on whichever one we want. So because I'm using Bootstrap, I didn't want to specifically flag container fluid because you can see container fluid is responsible for a lot of the operation of Bootstrap. So instead of calling container fluid, because I would be affecting all of these, what I do is I call either body right here, or I call covers, and then I say go into the row that's inside of covers by passing this greater than symbol. And then again, if you wanted to keep going, this is another Bootstrap class where you're saying I want 4 columns of the 12 segmented columns, and then I'm just saying this should display a certain way. It shouldn't float anywhere, so on and so forth. But everything that's in this right side, I could write in a style tag on the left over here if I wanted to. So CSS and HTML are very, very closely related. And I wrote this on Windows. And the way it was explained to me is WebKit should never work on Windows, but I found that when I called it on my div scroll, I was able to implement this Macintosh specific WebKit dealio. So if we look up WebKit CSS, what is WebKit? It's a CSS web browser rendering engine for Safari and Chrome. So one thing you may not realize is you're probably already running some version of Chrome because Google essentially took over the internet and they released their V8 engine as open source, which coincidentally Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, all of these browsers use as their engine. So when I'm talking about Node, and I say that Node is the V8 engine stripped out of this, so this is the terminal, but when I type in Node version, node console.log, hello, unexpected token. So it doesn't want me to write actual JavaScript here, but for all intents and purposes, Node is the same thing as these browsers running off of this Chrome engine. So that's why we're able to do stuff like Node, where are we? We'll change directory. Node example, doesn't like that. Node is for JavaScript. Store one. I forgot there's multiple stores. So if I type in node on this JavaScript file, we get that console log out that we input, that whatever time ago. But what this is doing is it's doing the same thing that our browser does when we say, hey, go to google.com. We get this response of JavaScript, and I'll even show this to you. If we watch this network tab, we're recording the network activity. If I refresh this page, we get Google, we get all of these requests back. But if I click, so this is HTML, we know that because it has those opening and closing brackets. But we get a ton of stuff back, right? We have a picture here, a PNG, we have a wolf file, I don't know what that is, JPG, JPEGs, web files. But here we can see the browser has identified these as JavaScript. And so if we just read this as if we were a computer, we get a domain name, we get a bunch of pictures, and then the very first thing is some JavaScript. Now, Google is very smart, and they're going to purposefully obfuscate their JavaScript. So this is the minification I was talking about. You guys might remember when I was saying, like, programmers will purposefully minify their files, but this is what's behind, like, every single website that you're visiting is JavaScript. So that's why Node is so monumental, and that's why this talking about Chrome is so important, because if it's talking about Chrome, it's kind of talking about like every browser. Chrome engine. You may have heard or seen this before, and look, Microsoft implemented Chromium into Edge. So if you guys remember, they rebranded Internet Explorer. That's because they implemented Google's engine, the Chromium engine. So even even Microsoft is using Google's web browser. This is what almost all of us are assuredly programming off of right now. It's free and open source. That's why it's so prevalent and why we see it everywhere, because it's open source. It doesn't cost any money to use. Google purposefully and outright distributed this code that compiles the JavaScript into C, which eventually compiles into machine code, for free. And they knew by doing this that eventually people would pick it up and all of the browsers would eventually become Chromium based. So it was actually very smart of them to do this, because they knew by releasing their engine as open source, it would eventually become the kind of like paradigm of the web. But at the time, there was multiple different compilers for browsers. So that's why sometimes you see stuff like in our boilerplate, if it's Internet Explorer 7, if it's Internet Explorer 8, blah, 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 right? Because there was a time where not every single browser had the same compiler. So as a web developer, you had to deal with stuff like this, where you're like, okay, well, is the browser Internet Explorer? Is the browser Chrome? Is the browser Safari, right? That kind of becomes cumbersome and annoying. So Google released their open source engine, which we're all, again, most assuredly on, and that's why Node is able to compile our JavaScript, because it's using that same free open source engine, Chromium, which is written in C, C++, and JavaScript. So to drive the point home, again, everything we're doing is essentially on the same compiler, on the same engine. It's just abstracted in different ways. The same thing that we can do in the console over here, we can do over here with Node. So this is the bash shell. If I do node this, then we get this kind of similar error. Cannot find blah, 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 uncaught reference error. It's running and evaluating this as if it was JavaScript. That's the purpose of Node. And that's why in our boilerplate, we have all these weird, if it's Internet Explorer, commented out stuff, because there was a time where you actually had to worry and consider what the type of browser the person was using, because the compiler would be different. This is very verbose. Here we go. Browsers based on Chromium. Opera, that's what I'm using. You guys are probably using Chrome. It's not even on here because it's Chrome. It's Chromium. It's like literally the original Chromium browser. So that's why it's not on here. It's just kind of implied, but Chrome is also a Chromium browser. We also see Amazon Silk. Amazon has their own web browser. Brave is a cryptocurrency web browser. Komodo is a firewall that you may have installed at one point. Microsoft, I think we all know Microsoft, and so on and so forth. Even on your, if you have an Android device and you open up the base APK Internet Explorer, that's a Chromium-based Internet Explorer as well. So right now on your Android phone, if you were to completely format it, wipe it, and boot it clean, it would have this Samsung Internet applet installed that's based on Chrome, right? Some of you may kind of recognize this logo. So that's the kind of important point to drive home, is that these are all the same thing because of Google. Because Google released their Chromium engine open source, which is awesome. Who doesn't love free stuff? And so now we don't have to worry about this crap anymore because everybody's using the same compiler. So if you were curious as to why that commented stuff was up at the top there, that's why. And then this is just saying implicitly from the beginning, this has a class of Node.js. Now this is just going to be ignored, but maybe if you wanted to come over to your CSS file and say, now this is no longer, this is not an ID, this is a class. So instead of a hashtag, I'll do a dot. And we do no minus JS. So now we're talking about the entire HTML document. If I was to start doing like background color equals, and I will do this on purpose. Like if I type in background color, now you can see like everything breaks, and when I start typing, I don't get any like prompts. If you ever end up in this scenario and you're like, I'm confused, what do I do? I'll do this myself, where I'll go all the way back to where this changes color back to white. I'll type in one letter and see it brings back up this autocomplete, and now when I hit enter, now I have access to this kind of like drop down menu again. So if you ever end up in this situation where like you start typing and then you're like, oh wait, I wanted that, and you start clicking here and you're like, how do I get that back? That's how. You just erase. This is still blue, so IDEs are great. If I type in A, it gives me everything that starts with A, but maybe you don't want the stuff that starts with A, you want to see the whole list. Erase it until it changes color. And now when I hit R, even though it knows, I hit enter again, I get that same prompt. And so, again, this doesn't mean anything right now. This will be ignored by the computer. This doesn't mean like to the browser like, hey, we're not going to run any JavaScript because like the entire web is based off JavaScript, so you can't just be like, no, I'm going to opt out of using JavaScript. Like, you have to use JavaScript. This isn't an option. So this doesn't mean anything right here. The computer's not going to read this and be like, oh, I shouldn't use JavaScript. I'm going to switch to Perl. I'm going to switch to a different language. You know, this is just saying like from the boilerplate, this is how the person wrote it. This doesn't matter. Now I come over here. Don't declare your attributes with exclamation mark because it's an operator in JavaScript, so you might run into issues like this where it's like, what are you trying to say this is the opposite of? The same way like if we were writing JavaScript and we said var true equals true, var false equals false, then if we console logged is not true equal to false, that would return true, because not true is false. So is false equal to false? I did this wrong. It should be 2. Yes, false is equal to false. That is a true statement. So that's why this is throwing an error, because it's using this JavaScript operator, the not operator, and it's saying like, what are you trying to tell me? It's saying, I expected this to start a curly brace. You see that? The IDE even says implicitly, I expected this to be a curly brace, but you're passing me some sort of operator that I don't understand. And it's not like we can't tell what it's talking about, because it literally underlines the exact exclamation mark that's giving us the problem. So like, if I come in here and just erase that, then we get rid of that problem. Now, it wants me to finish this statement. So I'll have my gap be a, again, gap. So let's erase this, gap. Gap, nope. Let's go all the way back. Line self, nope. Oh, probably because it doesn't like this JavaScript. Align self. Oh, because I didn't assign a background color, jeez. There we go. Align self, now we get the autocomplete, auto. Don't forget your semicolon, G, gap, gap. I've never used gap in my life. I don't know what this does, so I'll put 10. Seems like 10. There you go. That's CSS and HTML abstracted, talking about the compiler, JavaScript, and how this all kind of ties together. There we go. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so what I want, where is this? Oh, okay. what I want is for us to be thinking about ways where we can have a personal project and we can go to some sort of website. I'm trying to think of like a good example. I mean, I guess I could just show you guys my Q1 project. Now, I had significantly more time to prepare and write this, so obviously this isn't what I'm going to be expecting from you guys, but just as an example of like what is possible with just JavaScript, where did I have this? Used examples, CD and would it be CD Q1 project, ls. Now I'll use Node, and I'll show you guys this real quick. So I'm going to use Node to run this included method. You don't need to understand what this is doing, but one thing that I would like you to understand is that this is included with Node, right here, this HTTP thing. And we know that because I don't have to provide a path. I just say, hey, Node, I want to use this specific module that you provide, Node modules. Again, we get the HTML, we get the CSS, we get the JavaScript. If the string is not a string, prototype includes string.prototype.includes a function, and again, this is minified. This isn't what this file actually looks like. So they ran it through a minifier that took all of their variable names and shortened them to as short as possible. So that way it made the code more secure. But at the end of the day, this is still JavaScript. This is still saying like, hey, this is an object with a key value. That's a function. If this equals null, then throw an error, stuff like that. So if we go to, which one would be good? Right here. This is what we're using. What is a module in Node? It's the same thing as a JavaScript library. It's a set of functions that you want to include in your application. So a JavaScript library, or like any library, is a term to describe a power-up like a mushroom in Mario, where you have normal JavaScript, but then when you import a library, you have access to all of these methods that you did not personally write, but somebody else wrote that operates or like augments the way that the application works and innately, like at its core. So with Node, we're saying use this built-in module. We can look at the built-in module reference, HTTP, and we're going to use this to make Node.js act as an HTTP server. What's HTTP? It's the hyperlink text transfer protocol. So it's hypertext, it's markdown. What's markdown? In between these carets, right here. Essentially, it's almost like one of the most rudimentary ways of coding. That's what you could consider markdown. Let's close this. Close that. Don't need to save that. So don't use my key. I'll probably need to disable that if I upload this video. But what I'm saying right here, and it's funny because I use HTTP here, but then I use a external module called Axios, but you can see I just say go to this server, pass in this value, here are the parameters I provide to you, and then we're going to console log this data, we're going to set a response header, and you guys don't need to know all of this or understand it. I didn't at the time. I actually had my instructor help me write this. And so we're saying if the request.url is equivalent to API data, go to this link and then render all of this information. .catch is universal for errors. So if this was to error out, this .catch statement would take this error and it would console log it. But .catch is specifically connected to this statement. It's looking for an error inside here. So that's what .catch means, is you're catching errors. And then finally, st is an included module. This is just saying that if the path isn't this, then let's load up our file browser and we can process through our current working directory. And so I can show that to you guys. I do node, and I'll run this file, node server.js. There we go. So what I should have done is console logged when the server is listening, but I know it's listening because I can keep hitting enter and we're not getting any errors. So we're going to go to our localhost 8000, and this is my node server. So I didn't request, /API/data. So what it did was it just went right here. Take st, I don't know what st stands for off the top of my head, and just enter the path in as whatever the process's current working directory is. And so that's what just happened. And so this is my API data. This is the same thing I was showing you guys before we left yesterday. This is JSON, and in here we can see things like strings. This is a string. We have an integer value. We have a string with an integer value, so on and so forth. But we didn't request that. We just went straight to localhost. So this is my current working directory. And now if I go to project.html, maybe you guys remember this. I kind of showcased this earlier. But this is the WebKit scroll bar. This is not typically possible without using that WebKit thing I was showing you. And so now if I type in, I want Lisk, I want 100, and I type submit, I get the little icon. If I go over to my server, I can see that I have a ton of objects, a lot of objects. So I get the response from the server I hit. If I scroll up, Sandbox API coin market cap, version 1, cryptocurrency, listings latest, but look at this. Start at 1 and limit your query to 2,100, the same thing I have right here, right? So my browser knows that I want to get this information, and they set up this API so that it can accept these parameters, and then Node smartly knows to just take those parameters and just append them onto the end of the string. This is kind of like a universal URL parameter paradigm. So this isn't specific to Node. This is like HTTP protocol. Is you have your parameters with a question mark, and then start. We have start, question mark start equals 1, correct, and the limit equals 2,100. This is literally what this is doing right here. This params, it's just saying take this and then throw this on the end. So that's why we're seeing this in our console log. But then we get a ton of other stuff. What does circular mean? This means it's a stream. So this is an infinite loop. This stream never ends. We're always connected to the internet, right? So it's a circular object. It never ends. If I try to say where's the end of a circle, like if I kept walking in a straight line around the world, where's the end of the line, right? It's a circular object. It goes around forever. So that's what this is saying is this is a circular object. This data never actually ends. So this is our internet stream. This is our request. And there's a ton of stuff in here. Now, here's my header, symbols. And you get this from every HTTP request. It's just console logging because I console logged it right here. So I said, go to this endpoint. Then, this is just an anonymous function. Take the response from that server and just console log the data key. So this object is even bigger than what we're seeing. I'm actually just console logging the singular key of data coming back off of the response. I'm hoping to get back something like, here we go. So we have like a cryptocurrency. We have the cryptocurrency's trading symbol, what the slug would be. I actually don't know what that means. We have the date it was added to the marketplace. additional tags, what the max supply is, what the circulating supply is, so it's a currency. We have all of this information. And so this is actually how my application works, is when I type in LSK, it says there's a coin with this symbol LSK, and we're going to find out what that is, and we're going to take, now it doesn't show the price, but if I go over to my project, oh, gosh darn it. Okay, here it is. Project. This is DOM, and again, these hashtags are CSS, so these are classes. If I wanted to select a ID, I would use a period. So this is a hash for a class. In the same way we would write our CSS, we write DOM. So we're not talking about DOM, we don't need to get too in depth on that, but CSS works very similarly to DOM. Here I comment my code. This will keep the ID of the selected crypto. This will keep the name. I have a typo here. The symbol. This stores the input the user wants. So I have all of these placeholder variables in my project. So the first thing I do is create these variables that go into my HTML. And let me pull these up side by side. Close out of this. So right here, I'm referencing this JavaScript file in my HTML. So this HTML file will not load without this JavaScript file. It literally is impossible. Like the compiler, very first thing will come in here. It'll say, okay, this is a HTML document. We have an HTML tag. We have a head. Okay, cool. It's UTF-8. Cool, 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 cool. Oh, I need this JavaScript file. Let me go to this path that has been provided here and import this in. So really, in between this script tag is this entire file. Everything that I wrote here is present in here. Console, see that? See how it starts auto-completing console.log, because this is JavaScript in between script tags, because JavaScript runs the web. So when I'm saying right here in my head, this is a script tag and the source is this JavaScript project, it stops right here and it goes into this project, this file, and it loads everything I wrote here in between these two carets. So you might ask, why wouldn't we just write this in here? Let's do that. All right. So immediately we have added 260 lines to my HTML file. Okay, not ideal, but now we have access to all my JavaScript in here. And look, it's even colorized, because the compiler knows that it's JavaScript, because it's in between the script tags. So the reason we don't do this is because now, if I was to try and separate out my concerns, and let's just say this doesn't exist, right? Well, we still need a script tag, but we will get rid of the source. Defer just means don't actually run any of this code until all of the HTML has been brought in. So this isn't actually needed either, but it's good to just put it there just to make sure all of your HTML is there first. But here now we can see that it's not colorized anymore. We don't have that source. src equals blank. Interesting. So it looks like it does need that source. Or maybe my IDE is just bugging out because I just switched it back and now it's not working. So your mileage may vary, but for all intents and purposes, this is what it's, oh, because I have the closing tag here. There we go. I don't know how that got put in there, but yeah. Now if I erase this, Yeah. Don't need the reference, which is what I thought. No reference. This file might as well not exist over here. All the same. But now, obviously, this is extraordinarily harder to read. Let's pull this over, and we'll close this. Close this. Right? So, like, if I wanted to come in here and change some HTML, this is a pain in the ass, right? Because then I have to come in and be like, okay, you know, like blah, 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 blah. All right, cool, da, 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 da. And then when I save and I reload this entire file, the entire computer has to go through and re-render every single part of this entire file. Now, it's going to do that regardless, but if you're able to separate out those concerns when you start working on bigger and bigger projects, then you're not going to have this problem where we have a simple HTML file with 400 lines of code, because it's already separated out for us, and all we have to do is when we want to use JavaScript, we just go to the JavaScript file. When we want to use CSS, we go to the CSS file. So on and so forth. So now instead of 400 lines, I have 100. It's a little easier, right? A little easier to read. And as a matter of fact, a lot of this is comments. So let's see how much this actually is. Oh, and this is actually all the information I'm getting back. So, oh no, that's based off the widget. So I declared the size of the widget. I said what the symbol of the widget should be, the interval, daily, the time zone, universal time clock, so on and so forth. But ended up not needing that. Get rid of that. So this is only about like 80 lines of code. Right? A lot easier to read than if I was to just throw all of this in there and just be like, have fun, you know, right? So that's why these are different files, because it's easier for us to read and interpret. But like, if I wanted to, I could write all of this in my HTML file, if this would work with me. I could write all of my JavaScript in here, and then I could write all of my CSS in style tags. If we wanted, we would never need to open a CSS file or a JavaScript file. But that's a huge pain in the ass. So we separate them out, so that way when we want to work on CSS, we just go to CSS over here. Now I don't have all of this not polluting, but clogging up the viewport when I'm looking at my HTML file. So when I added this, that was 400 lines, and this right here is 200 lines. So instead of having an 80-line HTML project, if I wanted to have all of my functionality in this one file, that would be 600 lines of code. So now if something breaks, try to find what broke. Right? That's not fun. That's why this is all separated. Because even though these all work in the same way, they all are connected, we don't need to necessarily worry about the way that they're connected. We just need to worry about the different separated technologies, and then we can write out our concerns in a more isolated sense. So here we have the skeleton of my project, which is essentially saying, here's a container, here's a container, here's a container, blah, 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 blah. The CSS is saying, hey, when you find a container named this, then it should look like this. If you find a container named this, then it should look like this, so on and so forth, right? So this is kind of the looks. We have the skeleton, and we kind of have like the musculature of the skeleton. And then finally, to top it off, we have the brain, which is JavaScript. So over here, the same way I have the hashtag, I'm using the hashtag over here. So there's a class of scroll, the same way there's a class of chart button, same way there's a class of buy sell button. Let's try and find that. Where's the buy sell button class? Right here. Now it's an ID, and I misspoke. It is an ID because it's a hashtag. I remember that by the hashtag is like an H, so IDs are like hid. If you want to use a class, then it's straight to the point. That's the way I kind of like mentally remembered it. It's not too bad because there's only like 2 possible options. You're either using ID or you're using a class. But it's the same thing right here. Buy sell button. This is a JavaScript file. I'm saying go to this HTML document and using this method find this ID that says buy sell button. So when I'm talking about buy sell button here and I search this, right here, when I add the event listener to it at the bottom of the file, I'm talking about this HTML on the left side. So this is the same thing. We're talking about the same skeletal HTML element, but I don't need to come in here and say, hey, when you're clicked, on click, run this function and stuff. I don't need to write all of this functionality in here. I can just say in my JavaScript file, hey, there's a buy sell button, and when it's clicked, you should run this event. This new thing is visible. If it's already visible, make it invisible. Pretty simple. That is DOM, essentially. Like, we have CSS doing the same thing, hashtags, dots. We're saying what it should look like, and then over here in the JavaScript file, we're saying what it should do, how it should operate. And that's why we've been talking mostly about HTML, because at the end of the day, everything kind of can boil down to HTML. So questions about this, stuff that maybe you want me to clear up while we're on this? Feeling pretty good? Okay, I'll stop the recording there. Let's take like a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 7.